What does reversing through a false implication have in common with an appeal to consequences? The answer is that both are flawed, fallacious forms of a pattern of reasoning that I call a reverse proof. They are botched attempts to invoke the logical rule of inference known as Modus Tollens. More on all these things in just a moment. Hello, Internet. This is Sophia, the Red Angel, with another installment of Logic versus Fallacy Explained, where in each episode I discuss in depth a particular pattern of reasoning. I discuss both the valid form of that pattern of reasoning as well as fallacious forms of that pattern that constitute logical fallacies. In this episode, the pattern of reasoning that I will be discussing is one that I call a reverse proof. I will discuss the valid form of this as well as two fallacious forms, the first being appeal to consequences and the second being what I call reversing through a false implication. First, let us start with the valid form of a reverse proof. This is a proof that invokes a rule of inference known as Modus Tollens. In the YouTube video description area of this video, you can find a link to the Rational Wiki article on Modus Tollens. Reverse proof is when you conclude that a position is true because if it were false, that would prove that another position that you know to be false is true. In short, it goes as follows. The first premise that you must establish in advance is that if A is false, then B must be true. The second premise that must be established in advance is that B is in fact false. From that, you arrive at the conclusion that A must be true. If there is any doubt regarding the validity of this pattern of reasoning, it can be proven using a simple truth table. As there are two basic propositions involved here, A and B, this truth table has 4 rows. In the first row, A and B are both true. In the second row, A is true and B is false. In the third row, A is false and B is true. And finally, in the fourth row, A and B are both false. The truth table has 5 columns, one for each of the 2 basic propositions, and one for each of the 3 statements that we must evaluate that build upon these premises. You already know that the first column is A and the second column is B. The third column then is the negation of A, known as not A. The fourth column is not B. And the statement that the fifth column evaluates is if not A, then B, i.e. the assertion that if A is false, then B must be true. Since the fourth and fifth column state actual premises used in this pattern of reasoning, then any row in which the value of any of those columns is false is to be eliminated from consideration, as it does not fit the scenario stipulated in the premises. So let us examine the first row. In the third column, not A, our value is false, because we have established in the first row that its negation, A, is true. So we go to the fourth column, not B. Here the value is also false, as in the second column we have established that its negation, B, is true. And since that means that a column stipulated to be true in the premises has a value of false, this row is now eliminated from consideration. No need to even bother going on to the fifth column. Now let us examine the second row. Again, in the third column, we place the value of false. But when we go to the fourth column, we put a value of true, since the second column has established its negation to be false. On the fifth column now, remember, we established in the third column that the statement not A is false. And since this is a binary truth table, that means that any statement beginning with if not A then must be true. So this row passes the test and is relevant to evaluating the validity of reverse proofs. On to the third row. In the third column space, not A, this time it is true because its negation was established to be false in the first column. And in the fourth column space for not B, this time it is again false because we have established in the second column that its negation is true. And since the fourth column describes the scenario stipulated by the second premise of a reverse proof, this row is again eliminated from consideration. Once again, no point going on to the fifth column. In our fourth and final row, where both A and B are false, the values in the third and fourth columns that are the negations of these basic propositions are both true. On to the fifth column, if not A, then B. In this case, we have a situation in which the if is true and the then is false. So that makes the statement as a whole false. And since this column is what is stipulated to be true in the first premise of a reverse proof, that means that this row is also eliminated from consideration. Now, the first column of this truth table is the one that describes the conclusion of a reverse proof. Therefore, as long as at least one row remains in consideration, and in all of those rows remaining in consideration, the value of this first column is true, then this truth table proves that reverse proofs are indeed a valid pattern of reasoning. And it does turn out that the second row in this truth table is the only one in which the first premise, that if A is false then B must be true, and the second premise, that B is false, are both satisfied. And sure enough, in that row, the value in the first column is true. That means that a reverse proof, when properly done, is indeed valid reasoning. But if this pattern of reasoning is so airtight, how can it have fallacious forms? The answer is that sometimes you might be misled by a persuasive debater or propagandist, or even by your own cognitive bias, into thinking that both premises of this reasoning pattern have been properly established, when in fact one of them has not been properly established. And for that reason, there are two principal fallacious forms of this pattern in reasoning, one for each of the premises that you may have failed to properly establish. If you have properly established the first premise, that if A is false, then B must be true, but have failed to properly establish the second premise, that B is not true, then your fallacy is appeal to consequences. For example, let us suppose someone says this: the afterlife must exist, because if it does not, that means that we cease to exist when we die. In this case, they are replacing A with the statement that the afterlife exists, and B with the statement that we cease to exist when we die. So their first premise is that if the afterlife does not exist, not A, then that means that we cease to exist when we die, B. That premise is pretty much solid. I cannot see why anyone would argue with it. But their second premise, which they do not even bother stating, but which they plow on ahead as though it can be taken for granted, is that we do not cease to exist when we die, or not B. So when they reach their conclusion, A, that the afterlife does exist, that conclusion is arrived at fallaciously through an appeal to consequences argument, because their second premise is not properly established. But then there is that other fallacious form of a reverse proof to consider. If you have properly established the second premise, that B is not true, but failed to properly establish the first premise, that if A is false, then B must be true, then this is an example of what I call reversing through a false implication. I say I call this fallacy reversing through a false implication because I admit I do not know the already established name for this fallacy. But if there is not an already established name that I do not know, then that is surprising indeed, because this fallacy is far from unheard of. Creationists, young earth creationists especially, love to commit this fallacy. For example, they often ask, if human beings evolved from monkeys, how come there are still monkeys? When they make this argument, they substitute statement A with a claim that humans did not evolve from monkeys, and statement B with a claim that monkeys do not exist today. Now, of course, humans did not evolve from modern monkeys, but we did evolve from early primitive monkeys. To show how this is an example of reversing through a false implication, I will lay out how their argument is structured. Premise 1. If humans did in fact evolve from monkeys, not A, then monkeys would not exist today, B. Premise 2. We know that monkeys do in fact exist today, not B. Conclusion A. Humans did not evolve from monkeys. Now, we know that their second premise is in fact correct. There do exist monkeys today. No, not the ancient primitive species of monkeys that humans are descended from, but modern species of monkeys exist today. But their first premise, the claim that had humans been descended from monkeys, then there would be no monkeys today, that claim is completely unfounded. Evolutionary lines split up in different directions all the time. The same ancient species of monkey having multiple species descended from it, some of which remain what are considered to be monkeys, while others not remaining as such, is not only possible, it is not even something special at all. So, since the second premise is well established, but the first one is basically something that they pulled out of their posterior, that makes this an example of what I call reversing through a false implication. I could demonstrate the same with a lot of other arguments that you hear young earth creationists make, but I will not, because this is a video about logic, not about evolution. So what other patterns of reasoning, fallacious or otherwise, would you like me to cover? Let me know in the comments area below, or join my Discord and let me know there. You can find the link to the Discord on the Stay in Touch page of my blog, which is linked to in the YouTube video description area of this video. Please remember to click the like button, make sure that you are subscribed, and ring the bell. And until next time, see ya!